you guys do in your normal research life. But I'm absolutely convinced that the room that we have been giving so far to non-verbal material, anything which is, let's say, anything which is non-verbal, and if possible, anything which is not only visual. I do that because we work a lot on verbal and we work a lot on visual, but it just so happens that humans are not just talking heads, and it's just extremely important. And we know some people, for example, Bridget Sillon, who did specifically their work for years on non-verbal and non-visual parts of what is going on in museums, both on the emitter side, that is what has been built into there, and on the receiver side, that is how people react and how. So I think this is one part which is extremely important, and what is really related to this is that in many cases we see that it's in a non-verbal way that the subconscious things come out. And I think it's extremely important. So my question was, if I were to build up projects today, I would definitely look for people who would like to venture into that kind of things. I don't know if anybody here has something to say on that, or has been working on something like that. Everyone works with verbal.
Wow. I was yesterday, by chance, I was reading a new translation. I don't know if people know George Zimmer. Anyway, it was a piece from 1890. It's just been translated into Culture Society, and it's called The Art Exhibition. And it's George Zimmer's account of going to an art exhibition. 1890. It's account of the experience of being at the exhibition, and it's a sensory account of being there in the moment. And George Zimmer's written a few pieces. I'm writing a book about George Zimmer at the moment, and he's written a few pieces. There's a piece on the Berlin Trade Exhibition which is similar as well. And I don't know, it sort of feeds into his later work. I don't know if people know the Metropolis and Mental Life piece. That's the most famous thing Zimmer wrote. So, but his account of being there is the sensory accounts of modernity, trying to capture them in the kind of taking the focal point of the art exhibition and what it smells like, what it looks like, what it feels like to be there. You know, the kind of atmosphere, the nervous atmosphere of the space, and the kind of sense, and the pleasure-seeking people trying to seek pleasure sensory experiences that are beyond their sensory experiences of their normal everyday life. That's how he kind of encounters that space. So I don't know what I told you. Read more George Zimmer. Yeah. So that was I read that yesterday, but it just tapped into what you were saying, because I'm trying to write about senses at the moment through George Zimmer.
Well, then I would have another question: whether someone here maybe has worked on, let's say, active exploration versus more passive and guided exploration in museums, because this is again one of the things which comes out to be very, very important.
You mean like active versus passive in the museum environment?
Yeah, meaning just what Bill was saying, that if people are given the possibility and actually encouraged to actively explore wherever there is around, versus the usual conservative way by which we suppose that they follow a given presentation, a given thing, and they're just passive followers, and if possible, there is a good way to follow, and there is a maybe into the way to follow, but it's not, we don't account for the fact that they kind of interact add something, and actually the very way they explore things is something that deals at least as much with them and the action, uh, that with the fact that there's something presented to them and they're supposed to just follow it. I was, of course, thinking, first of all, kids could do that naturally, even if you try and prevent it. But if someone, and if you worked on that.
I'm not sure if I quite follow. I suppose one thing that I looked at in the past was an exhibition where it was seen at the time in the Science Museum as quite sort of, well, I think every exhibition people claim to be groundbreaking, but it had, oh God, I said that on there, but I'm nonplussed, but had the idea of that the visitor was supposed to be active, but I think that was kind of conceptualized in a quite a physical way, that they would engage, they would press buttons, they would do this and that, and I think there are multiple ways of being active, and it isn't always predictable in terms of the kinds of exhibit, or maybe it would be, but it's not in, I don't know, most of the, I suppose I'm a bit skeptical of a lot of the so-called interactive kind of modes, some of which I think actually produce something quite passive. So I think an active-passive binary maybe doesn't get at it quite, but maybe I'm not
sure you're right.
picking up
No,
what
sure
you
you're right. For
mean.
example,
Yeah.
to make, because you make me think of something when you're talking about culture consumption. Quite frankly, I was like, oh, are we supposed to do the culture consumption, or are we supposed to kind of live it and co-create what's going on? Meaning, I'm not being idealistic. It's just very different approach. Either we suppose that there is something to consume, or we.
I think something that really interests me, and it's probably something which is very simplistic, but it really does, is about what we mean by audience, obviously. And the use of audience throughout this symposium has been different. Everybody's using it in slightly different ways. I mean, it's very conventional. You're an audience. You sit around and you listen to a performance. Or you're an audience at an art gallery, which is a very different thing. And something Bill said right at the beginning, which I wrote down, I wanted to ask him about but didn't get the chance, was that people go to museums not just to see images, but to see people, to see other people. So you're alluding to the social element of visiting the museum, which is what you were talking about a little with this co-creation. And that wasn't really picked up until the final paper, which was your paper. And what you were saying was how important that was to people in alienating them from the experience because they felt socially and culturally they didn't belong to it, or in making them go. And I think that's the activity. I think all these things, I mean, an experience isn't just what you see, it's what you hear, the snack bar. My experience is as a commercial researcher and as an academic in a business school, so I have a slightly different focus. So it's about consumption generally, and how we tie those together. And I'd be really interested in hearing from all of you people who work in very different fields and who've really been studying this, what you think about that dimension of audience, how we actually make ourselves into an audience, how we perceive ourselves. I mean, when I go to use, I'm a market researcher, so I should never use a sample of one, which is me. But when I go to an art gallery these days, it's about culture and capital, and it's self-education, and also passing the time. I'm not going to look for other people anymore. But there was a point in my life when I did, I guess, perhaps a little bit. Sorry, it's rather amorphous what I'm saying, but that's actually the area I'm interested in for my possible research project into art house cinema, if that actually exists anymore. Why would people want to go and be part of an audience to watch a movie? And why a particular type of thing? So I'll stop talking because I can talk for ages. I'll be quiet. But does that link with what you were saying at all about the more active experience.
Yeah, it's definitely one very important part of it. It's the way people do whatever they do. It's very high. Of course, it's very highly social. And
do we know that though? Say museum visitors. Has anybody done any research?
Well, for example, we did. Yeah, for example, obviously, who did people around us did some obvious studies showing that, just as simple as that, people who come and visit in groups or in families, they definitely don't visit in the same way that single people. Just as simple as that, and the way they behave, and the way they not only, but just simply the way they look at things, the way they relate things to each other. It's a completely different behavior. So yes, of course, the answer yes. And question.
I mean, that also came out in your research because you were actually looking at how families walk around these spaces.
Yeah, and there are different studies of how museum visiting or tourism in general is not, at least not in all cases. You know, in sort of a classical tourism studies, it was like, oh, this is like in opposition to the everyday, and people sort of escaping. But I mean, some of the people working on tourism nowadays, I think, argue that much tourism follows particular formula. I mean, it's routine. I mean, like when I ask my museum visitors, so why do you come here? How come you're so interested in this exhibition? And they're like, oh, we're not interested at all, but we rented this holiday house, and I suppose we had to come here. That's what you're supposed to do when you're on holiday. So I think this. So in a sense, you could say, okay, so are they passive? But I mean, maybe it's sort of beyond this active-passive dichotomy. But I think that, and that was also my question, led to my question to your paper about this sort of, you know, this peripheral kind of people on the edges of, or, I mean, zapping on and off, or sort of drifting off, and the right you had to do that. I mean, it's sort of beyond participation in that sort of simplistic sense.
It's something to do.
Yeah, and it has its own codes and routines, and sort of everybody knows what we should do when we're interested.
Actually, we can relate this to one anecdote that you said earlier about the young girls that were playing with the hanging and another one taking picture. It's a kind of also maybe of a kind of visiting pattern for maybe teenagers, that when they are included in some very formal school group visiting, and I think it's also maybe an edge and can be analyzed on this way, not just put aside saying that this is not moral and this is, I think.
That this is, and this brings to me another question. That is somehow, well, of course, people probably do it less than anybody, but we somehow, when we work with the museums, and this with the museum directors and curators, there is this kind of general understanding that the museums are out there just the way they are. That is, people come in there without any. That is, the museum is supposed to deliver something just from scratch, and whatever it is. You come to a history museum, basically we think that you don't know anything about the thing, and then you are supposed to get out of there with a certain amount of knowledge. Of course, if you put it that way, they will say, no, that's not what we think. But actually, what I mean is that there's not much work bringing the way the museums are built up with any kind of other activity, be it educational or whatever. And I wonder if there are studies, social studies, that show any kind of link between the work in the museums, the way you know things are presented in the museum, in any kind of museum, and any kind of other work, you know, cultural activity or educational activity, anything that shows just how the museum work, the museum exhibition plays its role within a larger context. I think it's just extremely important. It only makes sense in that context, but usually it's studied if there were not context, simply because I know it's complicated, but the question was whether someone would do something like that.
The work I'm preparing, I'm going to China next week to study how local visitors in an exhibition dedicated to the Three Gorges Dam forced migration, and the people I'm going to follow and the families, they actually experimented this forced migration. And before the exhibition was created, the pictures and the video that will be in the exhibition have been played over and over again for the last 10 years in the local media or during official festivals. And what I would like to see also is I already studied how they react in front of the TV or during the festival. But in the context of the museum, it will be arranged differently, and in one room, every exhibit will be linked together. Video, the pictures, and text. And this is something I would like to see how they will react differently to this kind of object they had interaction with.
So you think that the context in which they view it will change the kind of audience they are?
I think that not the context. I think that because they will have maybe half an hour in this room, and I would like to see the discussion that it stimulates all together, because they will be in this place with these things to see. They cannot escape. When they are in front of the TV, they are cooking, they are talking about, and it's a different social situation.
You are interested in studying this kind of mediation or mediators, because I found very interesting when you say that we're going to observe people and how they react when they are with this kind of exhibits. And but I don't know. I was wondering if it's you are taking into account, or how are you going to understand this kind of exhibits, maybe some mediators that in a way are influencing the way people react, and in a way, does that mean that maybe there's no particular and homogeneous audience, but maybe there are different audience and heterogeneous?
It's a very local place. Maybe maybe 85% of the visitor will be people from this country that have experimented the transformation there. But I cannot tell you because I haven't done my fieldwork, and I really do think that we cannot build some framework and say, okay, I'm going to see if it will work on the field. I'm a social anthropologist. For me, first, I just see what's happening, and just after I will try to let myself be guided by what I am saying on the spot, and what people tell me, and what I see, and what they don't tell me that I see. And
it's just that this kind of comments that you are doing reminds me much about the notion of mediations and audience, and what kind of, for example, age, gender, education, all these are kind of mediations that participate in how do people give sense to particular meanings.
Yes.
So rather than being on the contrary, on the opposite side, it's more people how people engage with, what do people do, and what kind of audiences emerge.
Yeah, and with their background, their own background, and it's what Max was saying about the situation. How we need also to know where the people come from, the experiences they had before, because when they are interacting in the museum, for example, or heritage site, what happened before for their family, or maybe their ancestry, if there is some history in the family, some legends, or if they have a special sense of belonging that can play in this specific time. This is also why I plan to do visit with families I know for 10 years now, So I think for me, I would need to have this information, understand how they visit the place.
Yeah. Yeah. And also in a way that's also part of my comments that I did earlier about this notion of category about users and participants, because what can we do when people is highly motivated and say, yes, I want to participate in a particular place, I want to go to a particular historical site or a particular museum. I wonder if that kind of motivation in a way doesn't change the way to understand users or participants. Yeah, because early you made a very interesting comment that not me to think too much about this notion of participant. You say something like, well, if a local government open an institution, then it's in a way is influencing people so that they participate. But what if on the other side, what if people decide to go because it's like becomes something motivated? Don't you think that changed a little bit this structure of power?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I'm very much, I think, in resonance with what Sharon said about this sort of the term interaction, and sometimes also the term participation, or other sort of words that get sort of incorporated into cultural policies or museum policies, whatever institutions. And I was just, I think my suggestion, advice is just to be quite wary of sort of accepting, participation as a sort of as one activity, and actually look at it in terms of. That's why I sort of said I want to study use instead of participation. So looking at it, what actually happens in these kind of interactions, where a focus on participation or interaction or user-driven innovation can sometimes, blinker you and sort of set up blind spots.
No, thank you. Yeah, because I think that perhaps the idea is more to understand what kind of issues are involved with, so that we can get to that notion of participation.
And of course, then maybe those who sort of think they know what participation means from the top.
Yeah.
It could be. I mean, you could discuss the sort of emerging ideas of participation.
I find Tia Denora's invocation of the term affordances really helpful in that sense. She, as I'm sure many of you know, uses the word affordance to indicate something of the way in which, with aesthetic materials, in her case, she's studying music, the music has certain qualities and characteristics which provide certain kind of opportunities for use without prescribing those uses. So what might be interesting for us is to study precisely what are the characteristics and qualities of the aesthetic objects and the contexts in which they're engaged with, and precisely what are the ways in which they are appropriated, or to use Denora's phrase, pressed into use. That seems to me to be precisely the thing which we should be studying, rather than presuming that we know what use constitutes or what participation constitutes, but rather to be specifying and exploring and examining what is participation here, what is pressing into use here, what is appropriation here within this particular space with these particular qualities of the aesthetic objects and institutional conditions.
I think you're very right, and I very much agree with you. And I think that's one of the strengths of Denora's framework. My only thing is that I don't think it's enough, because I don't think there is only aesthetic values in participation. And I would like to echo Madame's feedback, because I think there are moral values, there are social values, and all of this are taking part in the way we participate and how we use and consume things. But I do agree that aesthetic values have been completely understudied, and at least in my field, at least in sociology, it's something we tend to disregard because sociologists don't really like to, I don't know, to deal with aesthetics, which because it's kind of a complicated matter. I also wanted to say one thing is that we talk a lot about museums, but we need to differentiate museums and museums because you have loads of museums, and you have science museums, you have history museums, you have art museums, and all these museums tend to be quite different, and also in the way they interact with their audience. And for instance, modern, especially contemporary art museums, tend to be quite classical in the way quite a lot of them tend to be quite classical in the way they actually present work to the audience, compared to, for instance, science museums who tend to be much more innovative and etc. So I think we need to differentiate different types of museums.
I mean, one thing I did notice about the presentations about the institutions was I wanted to know, I'm sure you all do know, what the objectives of the people running them were, so what audiences they thought they were attracting. So, for example, you contrasted two museums, but you talked a lot about the open air one. Now, to me, that looked like something that was targeted at families with younger children, and yet you were talking about these older Germans who were walking around and being quite snippy about it, and saying this doesn't capture the spirit of what we're trying to communicate about war. But it's about intention. It's the discussion is as if there was no intention in the way that the thing was set up in the first place. So it's whether the audience's response matches the intention.
So that's the point. I think that's very important. That's actually what I was trying to say, that the immediate. I mean, I completely agree. We should focus in detail on what actually goes on in the immediate encounters, but we should also take account of the framings, including intentions and expectations, both from the audiences, but also the planners and the two institutions. In my case, had some very complex, entangled histories of contestation also. So that should be accounted.
Can I add something in there, because I think it's really important, the intentions and so on. But there's more than that, and I suppose one thing that I feel with the cultural production side of things and products, there's often a kind of thought it's all just about what was intended, but and Mads has done this kind of work as well. I mean, the sort of work that I've sometimes done where we're really looking kind of at what goes on in production and what is, and again, it's back to this issue of what people sort of actually articulate and state, but a lot more goes on than that, and that actually often has consequences that people haven't even considered. And I suppose in some ways the space syntax shows that, because people might have had an idea. I mean, these IKEA-style galleries, as you describe them, with these one route, that often comes out of a really didactic kind of idea that people will learn in that way. But there's other things that have kind of gone on, and there's also misconceptions about how those things work, and we really need to understand those as well. And I think I found today one of the things I thought was really strong is that there has been kind of pulling out of sometimes quite unexpected things, and in some ways these are people paying attention to the other people, or I don't know, the particular kinds of formats and things that's come out, I think, quite strongly. So
sorry, I'm very interested in what you say about this whole didactic nature, and this is something, because I mean, I'm Stephanie's PhD student, and we very much look at it's classical music, but kind of so live arts, and obviously a lot of the talks have been about museums, heritage, and things like this. And what came out of the talks about museums is the work that you're doing seems to be in order to better adapt the museum so that people get the experience that you want them to get, so they're taught the things that you want to teach them. Whereas I'm wondering, and I don't have any answers, do we have that same moral imperative within live arts? Because on the surface you think probably not, it's there for experience and maybe entertainment, enrichment, but actually from my experience in classical music there is that moral imperative that we want the audience members to have the ultimate experience, and I'm certainly interested in kind of problematizing that. But I don't know if anyone's got Any thoughts on
Maybe you end up like that because of the type of audience that, you know, it goes back to the question about the type of audience you're looking at. You're looking at, you know, a lot of the work there is about a particular type of audience going to a place of that we're conceiving to be of education, whereas, you know, there's lots of different types of audiences that we could comprehend there, isn't there? So, you know, the type of work I've done on popular culture, which I never really thought about being about audiences really, but, you know, it's been rebadged to convenience.
A tag.
There's no moral imperative there. It's very, you know, it's not about that at all really. But it's also, you know, a very complex audience that isn't homogenous and isn't going to a particular what they do, reviews like that. Isn't necessarily going to a place to consume something where you can understand their behaviours in that place, or even get a sense of the materiality of it, or intention. You know, all culture has intentionality to it. So those types of audiences don't necessarily, you know, the unknowability of the way that intentionality plays out in cultural consumption, it just makes it an unfathomable thing that you would struggle to even know where to start. I think.
One of the things you said right at the beginning of your talk was about how you landed on this topic.
Yeah.
About the way people group themselves. And from memory, you didn't actually say it explicitly, but what I took from that is you belong to a group because you don't belong to another group. And if you're badging yourself as death metal, you don't want anyone to like you, basically. And that's quite important. So that's got intentionality.
It has got intentionality, yeah, of course.
So you're listening to that music much because the music delights you, because it really annoys your neighbour. In the world.
But also gives you a sense of belonging with the other people that maybe subscribe to that category. I mean, that's really what I was trying to get at, and the idea of why cultural ordering matters. It plays out in the individual lives in different ways. Now, it's complex to understand that, but I think we need to. I mean, I think you know, doing sociology of this would be to try to understand the way those processes operate more broadly, as well as within the lives of individuals. Because it matters how an individual responds to the intention of culture, but also you need to get a sense of how, I think, you know, on a broader scale, I think, how culture operates, you know. But yeah, there's a sense of belonging attached to those labels in the same way there's a sense of discontent and distancing, discomfort, and people being uncomfortable with the labels they are given as well. So,
I mean, similarly, we're not to
or more so.
More so.
I would have thought.
So Mads, you've been trying to get
No,
into
it's just that it's not really a good answer, but it brings me to being there's a clear difference in these. I mean, I agree we should differentiate between these different kinds of audience studies, but there seems to be a clear difference between these kind of studies where, as you said, death metal. I mean, this is about audiences, if we call them that, that sort of relate to each other. So there's an internal structure or you know, distinction work going on between boundaries in the audiences themselves, and then there's a question of those who actually provide the show or the museum exhibit. I mean, which is different from a sort of didactic museum setting, because and what appropriateness means, appropriate or desirable audience behavior in a museum is perhaps different from this kind of subcultures, where it seems to me that appropriate behavior is who do I want to group myself with in the fan culture, more than relate to the works or the, I don't know, but it needs some kind of different.
Don't you get that in museums? I don't
Yeah,
go to museums.
maybe you do.
I don't go to them. I don't know what happens in them, but I'm guessing you know that you get the same. I know I have got a distinct
You've got a different kind.
Yeah. But I'm assuming the same thing. You know, the
relation.
same thing happens. Are you somebody who's in the know? Do you know the right sort of things?
Mm.
You know,
Or friends are, for that matter. Are you a supporter of a museum, or do you just go?
Yeah.
That's a label. There's definitely that within arts organisations.
You know, that's the equivalent of are you a fan of that band and wearing the right clothes and stood in the right place at a gig or something, isn't it, maybe?
It's also money, of course, involved. So there's that commitment, and there's that element of exclusion as well.
I suppose that links as well. I mean, there is the politics to which kind of groups there will be more audience studies of. So institutions that are basically getting money from the taxpayer and so on, that is where there is often a lot of that kind of work going on there too. So, I mean, in a way, the fan groups, they'll choose their music. It's more just works in a different kind of way economically too. So that maybe produces a different kind of audience studies as well, which is why we have certain kinds of studies quite often too.
See, then you start to think, well, are there audiences that are more visible in social research than others as a result of the politics of the circulation of capital?
And there are.
So,
I mean, in a way, that was the thing I mentioned right at the beginning, desperately seeking the audience work by Yen Ang. That's exactly the kind of question she was really asking there.
The commercial organisations have access to research which isn't published, so we can't see it. It doesn't mean they're not doing it, it doesn't exist. In fact, there's masses on it. But the kind of organisation I'm interested in doing my research on is dependent on people like me, and the research you've done is dependent on people like you. But it doesn't mean it's not being done, it's just good to know. And how much of what you do is being used commercially, because they can see what you're doing, you can't see what you're doing.
I'm interested to ask those people who've done active research with cultural organisations, to what extent you feel there is an anxiety within those organisations about their audiences and lack of. Because I'm a professional archivist as well as a researcher, and there is certainly an anxiety within archives about our audiences and lack of diversity within those audiences, and also the decline in them. And I'm interested, my research is part of a collaborative doctoral award, the outcome of which is to develop methodologies for engaging more diverse audiences. So it springs directly out of that anxiety, but have the organisations and institutions that other people have worked with expressed those same uncertainties?
Right. Could probably say something like this. We on another part of our project, as I said, we work a lot on archives, and I think it brings us to the first level content or non-verbal or whatever you call it. That is, let's face it, there might, well, you can go to a museum, you can go to an art exhibition, but you can do many other things in your life instead of doing that. And if you, one of the questions is, okay, if you want to see, I don't know, Gioconda, or why the hell would you go to the Louvre? Whereas you can go just to a computer, open it, and see the right. So why do people still go to the museums? What is the difference between going to a museum really, or exhibition, or going to a concert rather than the concerts are a very good example, because for many people go to modern concerts, the participation and the feeling of other people around, I mean, it's a really huge thing. So they at least that's what we see. But so there is definitely this competition and for archives, if you can, if you can stay home with your computer and get the same data, why bother going to? But we definitely know, talking about people you said you're talking about, we definitely know that many of us still go to the museums and to the concerts because the way we feel there, the kind of immersion, which is not just the simple content, but the immersion that we feel there, even if we are out of the age where we are interested in other people. I'm talking about myself as well. Still, we do that, and so there's something about it. And again, there are people close to our project who work on this sense of immersion, on the feeling.
Audience itself. I mean, this comes back to the subject, which is what is it to be part of the audience? What do we mean? You know, to be an audience in a jazz club is different to be an audience sitting and watching a movie, different to be an audience for a work of art. So what does it mean to different groups, different people? I don't know.
And also simply the size and the fact that there is the whole of the space, not only just this particular picture and everything.
What is the experience of being with other people? How do they impinge on? If you're Danish and you hear Germans being rude about your children's enjoyment, you know, just what impact does that have on them? If you're going to see an opera and you've got a group of your people sitting there looking at them thinking, why are you dressed like that? How do we relate? Or I go see a film in my local art house cinema and I look round and I see everybody looks like me, which is what I do actually. It's rather depressing. Except at least I don't crunch the popcorn too much. Is that why I go there? Is that why they go there? What's all that doing to just what we're watching and what we're listening to?
Maybe I'll share this a little bit because I can see. So, no, just because I can see there's lots of people trying to jump in. Laurie, you had something to say, and you have something to say on that.
Question.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the political context and on the political pressure and also who's funding the institutions. At the moment, there has been loads of cuts, and basically museums and other cultural institutions that really work, and they really are afraid because if they don't, then basically the audience it's first a source of income, but also it's a source of legitimacy. So they need the audience. They're desperately looking after them and also looking for them, and the more they have, the better it is for them.
Yeah, just to follow on from that and to respond to your question as well, I've been involved in a piece of research in Leeds which has involved some quite sort of extended collaborative research with a small number of participants, but has also involved conducting interviews with a range of arts organisations across the city. And it seems to me from that work that there's a lot of anxiety about audiences, both in the sense of developing, cultivating, attracting, engaging audiences, but also an imperative to kind of demonstrate the value and impact of the work. And we've been quite interested in this project thinking about the different kinds of ways of knowing about the value of the experience of participating, which are going on through the institutional processes of demonstrating their value and through our participants and their conversations with us. So I'm quite interested in the question as to what we feel our different imperatives might be for studying audiences. Do we feel that there are mismatches or synergies between the ways in which arts organisations are interested in studying audiences and the ways in which in some of our university departments we might be interested in studying audiences? Are there different imperatives to the studies that we're making, or are there kind of synergies between arts organisations and our own ways of knowing about audiences?
I think this project probably has a lot to say on.
Yeah, I have. I'm also involved in a collaborative doctoral work, and this whole idea of there being one aim through kind of arts organisations and commercial research, and another aim through academic research has been, well, the last kind of 8 months have been a struggle of trying to work out a common ground between those two, and there is absolutely, without doubt, a difference in what they want. And again, coming back to this idea of funding and audience members being a source of legitimacy, not only a source of box office income, it's this whole, I think from personal experience, arts organisations would be more than happy for their current number of audience members to just up their tickets. And the desire to get new members in, you know, providing their audience is kind of sustaining itself, the desire to get new, mostly in connection with getting funding and proving that they're making the effort and the kind of that side of it, rather than, I think from an academic side of it, we're more concerned with the ethical implications and, you know, what is the future of the art form in itself. And so, sorry, yeah, I've spent the last 8 months trying to justify why my project is valuable in a commercial sense. So there is absolutely a different aim.
Yeah, I have to excuse us because Bill's taxi's here. So I'm just, well, I hope it is. I'm just going to check. But keep going if you wish.
Bye-bye. Good to meet you.
Bye. I recently was part of a team of people who were trying to develop a AHRC funding and a research network with the National Archives. And that conversation broke down over exactly this issue of motivation, because the network was supposed to be about understanding audiences of archives. And during the conversation about what that research network would entail, the kinds of people who would be involved, the research questions that would be at its heart, the National Archives returned again and again and again to its motive, which was to find out how they could work out how to get more audiences for its paid-for services. And that's why they wanted to engage with academic research, was because they thought it would be a good, quick, cheap way of finding out how they could put more records online and get people to pay for them. And that was quite in conflict with the work that the academic researchers were interested in doing as part of the network. And so my sense is that a lot of organisations where their money is being squeezed and they are funded by government particularly, they're looking to academic research to inform their business strategy. I don't know if you are finding this.
Yes.
Sure.
But actually, just the doing of research for these people helps them to meet their targets, because the project I did a while ago, which was a semi-commercial project for an art house cinema, they used to get lottery funding. So they submitted my report, which I thought was great. I thought it told them all about their audience, really interesting. It would also help them increase sales, because I'm interested in that anyway. They just liked the thickness of it, the fact it had my university's name on it, and that they could submit it as part of the lottery. And they got money. So I wouldn't despair. I mean, whatever you're doing for them, even if it's tangential, will be use, and they will find use. The association itself.
I've heard other people working in other areas express those same concerns. You know, the discomfort that arises from trying to align your own agenda with that commercial funding agenda people are working for. That's come up in other seminars I've been to, people working in a totally different area. Yeah. So I suppose it's like as the impact agenda spreads, then the difficulty arises of aligning what they see to be. I mean, there's sometimes
giving you access and they want something back.
Yeah, of course.
That's what it's about. You know, they're helping you, so what are you going to do to help them?
That's right. Yeah.
Which is not unreasonable.
But,
that's the way you phrase your research.
No, it isn't. But it can create discomfort in the part of the part of the researcher. That's the distinction, I think.
It's also ethical problem.
Yeah.
It's maybe because I'm working
Well, the
on China,
discomfort
but
can be dramatic.
yeah, you're asking people information. You're taking information for people just to for companies to get more money from them. I think
it's a
wrong.
Yeah, the difference is, I mean, the organisation I did it would count as a not-for-profit organisation, so you can kind of square it like that. You know,
non-profit organization, they also always have a profit somewhere, even if it's not a financial benefits.
I think there's a difference between doing it for something which has a charitable status and something which hasn't. But I understand it's a really awkward area.
So we did this project with the Danish tourism authorities, which are very commercially oriented, and they just wanted to develop better facilities to attract more German bicycle tourists. So, which is a very, clear-cut commercial agenda. So what we did, and sort of insisted in doing, was that to try to sort of by doing our project in a sort of weird, convoluted way, actually telling these project partners that, well, the questions you were actually think you needed to be completely rephrased, because we need to understand what do we mean by users. What do we mean by user-driven innovation? I mean, trying to move to a more sort of, I think, interesting level of how these kind of concepts emerge and what people do with them out in. So I think, and I actually think, I don't know, it's not the solution to everything, but I think these partners that we had actually got something out of it, even though we didn't, you know, provide answers to their original questions. So it's an indirect way in which we sort of work to change the research agenda from within. That makes sense.
I suppose I'm also sort of interested in our own motivations for studying audiences. Again, mine is rather mixed because I work in archives as well. So one of my motivations is to increase the audience for archives. And do you come from the same place? Are you just interested in understanding them, or do you look for something to come out of your research in terms of diversifying, increasing, broadening, deepening relationships?
I started doing this because they approached me, and it's something I do. I like cinema, so it's kind of not very pure reason, is it? For doing it, but just an interest.
I would say I'm actually not very interested in audiences per se, but I'm interested in sort of fundamental questions about you know, human perception, identification, or relations between land and identity, or whatever. So these kind of questions. And then it just happened that I stumbled upon some people for whom these issues, I mean, as a sort of lab for studying these kind of questions. But I wouldn't say it's not the audience development. Sort of.
I don't know. When we started this project, and as I said to some of you, it's as simple as that. What I'm interested in, what we're interested in, is simply in the future of our kids. What world will they living in? What will they living in? And from what we understand, this is very tightly linked to how they understand the present and the past world and all the important things that happen, so that simply that not only they won't happen again, which is not, but basically how they will behave when things like that will start happening. And again, as a neuroscientist, we know that it's as simple as that. I mean, Germans are not Germans, fascists and people from the resistance, they're at the beginning, they all have the same brains. It's just they behave differently. So basically that means that anyone who doesn't pay attention to his own education and to his own behavior has very high chances to, in some circumstances, start and behave in such a way that he or she will regret it afterwards and will not even imagine that he or she will be behaving that way. So our idea was to understand what's going on in the museums, simply because we want, we want to make sure that we give to the kids who come to the museums as much as possible to prepare them for life. And this actually comes to the intentional question. And of course, what we figure out is that, okay, there are the intentions of the researchers, but there are also intentions of those who build the museums, and we again figure out that you said about how moral or immoral it is to. But when I see things like it's as simple as that, I can quote two very big museums that we've been working with, and that is the Cannes World War II Museum, and the Cannes World War II Museum is the largest museum in France dealing with World War II, and they economically they are supposed to be independent. There are no funding coming from the state, which amounts to the equivalent of £15 per person to get there. So of course the question would be how the hell people, how to expect people, with families and all that, just to go there and spend all this money or than spending on something else. And I know very well the director of that museum, so he is supposed, on one hand, carry his museum in such a way that there will be more and more audiences, so this is how he will be judged. Okay, so it's a very commercial basis. It's supposed to be rentable and also get as many people there, whatever they do, as there are. But on the other hand, I know him personally, and I know that he took that job, and he's been doing whatever he could just to go for that first part. That is to make sure that he presents the best what he can of history for that.
I mean,
and then
it costs £15 to go into those museums. But here in the UK, most of our museums are free. Just to throw something else in, which shouldn't, how does paying for things change our experiences of being an audience? And you've got exactly the same cultural institutions overseas. You've got the great museums. You have to pay €12, €15 to get into most of them. Here you can wander into the British Museum for nothing. How does that affect one's audience?
Apparently,
Doesn't.
apparently
There's no difference whatsoever.
according to the studies, it doesn't.
It affects the way we perceive it, or the way
It doesn't
we
change the profiles of the visitors, if you want. I mean,
the way we conceive our.
it's not more open in terms of socio-demographic background, etc. But you would need to double check, but this is what I had in mind.
I wonder if, although it might not affect the demographic makeup of the audience, whether or not it does change their expectation, though, in terms of what they will receive in return for their
the
money.
way they use the space as well.
About higher education now.
Well, I suppose it's very similar.
I guess
Our students' audience.
it might be different from different countries. I know that there is in 2008 in China, all of museums, national museums, became free entrance, and I know some museums in Sichuan and Chongqing that the people that came, it exploded, the number exploded, that they had to do some free ticket for each hour they give that the people. So obviously there is a change of audience in a very strong way.
I think in the research I've been doing for the teenagers mainly in the UK, and the idea of having a free museum is a way to actually encourage maybe the minority audience members that aren't coming. It's a way that a lot of museums are actually looking to try and target the audiences, maybe so far unsuccessfully, but it is, I think, one thing they're going to try and promote more in the future.
I think that your question is very interesting because then it's I think that you are going beyond and you are trying to explore other variables, for example, political, economic situations. To what extent that kind of have an influence to people intentions to
All three museums.
Yeah.
And what, for example?
Well, the argument will be that they don't that you pay more attention if you pay for something. That's the classic. So I've been reading about the distinction between people going back to vinyl records because put those on, it means they pay. They feel that they pay more attention to the music rather than they just stream. I don't know if that's true. That's the kind of conjecture about it.
I'm afraid that I will probably close the debate now, but because it's already 5:30, and I know that some of you will have to go home. You're welcome to stay a bit more if you want more wine and crisp and etc. But if for those who want or who need to leave, you're very much welcome to do so. So don't. I guess we can walk, discuss, exchange in a more informal way than in a circle. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for coming here today, and it was really, really rich, and I enjoyed the day, so I hope you did as well, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
I